In a move that defied all odds, Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Interpol have just dismantled one of the largest synthetic drug routes ever recorded in the Sahel. In less than 48 hours, they intercepted 10 tons of amphetamines in Burkina Faso, hidden under the guise of an agricultural aid project. But this isn't just a drug bust. It's a tangled web of financial laundering, diplomatic loopholes, and staged foreign partnerships. The traffickers wore the badges of international development agencies, their trucks plastered with charity logos, yet their cargo was nothing but chemical death. Consider the numbers. From 2015 to 2020, Sahel cocaine seizures averaged a mere 13 kilos per year. By 2022, that number had exploded to 1,466. Now, we're talking about a mind-boggling 10,000 kilos of synthetic poison seized in a single hit. Why now? Why here? And why was it Captain Traoré, young, defiant, and relentless, who dared to pull back the curtain? This is more than just another raid. At 2:12 a.m., an encrypted call lit up the Sahel Regional Command Terminal in Ouagadougou. The signal originated from Gao, Mali, a city long perched between military zones, rebel strongholds, and corridors where oversight thinned into whispers. A convoy of unmarked vehicles had slipped past local checkpoints. With no license plates or transponder signals, they moved with a confidence that suggested powerful protection. Their route was a familiar one. An old petroleum transport line, once critical during French operations in the region, now half abandoned. What official records called a low-risk corridor was, in fact, a shadow highway for unmarked trucks. Flanked by personnel wearing emblems of European aid organizations, the convoy moved with a chilling confidence. One man wore a vest from Agro-Sahel International, while another displayed the badge of a long-defunct logistics outfit, once linked to failed medical distributions in Niger. Were these genuine aid workers, or was something far more sinister being moved behind the shield of international logos? The field team's infrared drone told a different story. Before the convoy even reached the neutral zone, its scans detected an unusual thermal profile, a consistent heat radiating from the lower cargo levels. The manifest submitted to Malian customs claimed they were transporting seed grain and fertilizer for seasonal replanting. But anyone with experience in agricultural storage knows that seeds don't generate heat, at least not at this level. So, what was causing the thermal spikes in sealed containers, supposedly holding fragile biological products? Captain Ibrahim Traoré, briefed on the spot, didn't hesitate. His voice was sharp and decisive over the secure line. Maintain full visual tracking. Do not intercept until they cross the Burkina Faso line. It was a high-stakes gamble. What if the cargo was genuine? What if the delay allowed the convoy to disappear into civilian zones? For Traoré, the timing was critical. Engaging the convoy in Malian airspace, especially near a demilitarized strip, risked a diplomatic firestorm. This zone had enjoyed a blanket inspection exemption for years, a legacy of outdated international aid agreements signed back in 2013. Why had no previous leader questioned these exemptions? Who truly benefited from keeping parts of West Africa blind to inspection protocols? For the next 14 hours, the trucks moved relentlessly south, unknowingly toward their final destination. The sun climbed higher, the dust of the road thickened, and the digital trail became razor-sharp. Every drone unit was a silent eye, relaying continuous telemetry, speed, stops, and refuels. At 16:03, the lead truck finally breached the sovereign boundary of Burkina Faso. It was at this exact second that Captain Traoré initiated an order that would send shockwaves through the diplomatic establishment of the Sahel, a 6-hour total lockdown of the northern border. All crossings were sealed, civilian routes, aid corridors, commercial links. There was no distinction. The directive reached 12 outposts and activated 11 satellite relays. For the first time in modern West African intelligence operations, a sovereign government had shut down a multinational corridor without pre-clearance from any Western liaison. The response from foreign desks was immediate. There were frantic calls from French security advisors, silent pings from EU development officials, and even encrypted queries from old UN field monitors. None of them received a reply. But the real question wasn't about the cargo. It was about the act itself. Who gave Ibrahim Traoré the moral and political capital to override decades of soft power and unspoken permissions? Why now, when global focus was shifting from the Middle East to the Pacific? What made this convoy so different? In the intelligence room, every second ticked against a risk assessment chart. Not since 2019 had any West African nation ordered a full regional border hold without citing civil unrest. Yet there was no riot, no outbreak, just a set of suspicious trucks, a stretch of dirt road, and a president unwilling to let it pass. When the 6-hour border lockdown snapped into place, the convoy didn't vanish. It stalled, immobilized just inside Burkina Faso's jurisdiction. The vehicles were silent, their drivers refusing to engage in dialogue. But Captain Traoré had no interest in roadside theater. The next order came swiftly. Initiate Operation Sahel Sahara Phase 7, a directive that would later be recorded under Interpol's Joint Mission Protocol. This wasn't Europe's playbook. Captain Traoré had spent months rebuilding the intelligence grid, AI pathing algorithms, and terrain-adaptive heat maps with local engineers and Ghanaian digital forensics experts. Now, these tools were about to face their first real test. Within 48 hours, the entire suspected route of the convoy was digitally reconstructed. The AI overlaid commercial freight patterns against historical NGO traffic, plotting every detour, every delayed checkpoint, and every unscheduled rest stop. It found that 3 previous convoys had used 89% of this same route. None had declared a proper manifest, and all had vanished into the Sahel without inspection. Why hadn't anyone noticed until now? The response team was swift, specialized, and local. 48 Burkinabe soldiers, handpicked from the National Counter-Trafficking Unit, joined forces with 4 Interpol coordinators. An elite 3-person analytics group from Accra's Cyber Risk Bureau operated in mobile data units, scouring satellite time codes for patterns of evasion. At 1946, just outside Garam Goram, a fixed-wing drone's heat scans picked up thermal anomalies within the second truck. Containers that supposedly held agricultural lime were emitting high core temperatures, illogical unless something else was packed underneath. The extraction took less than 20 minutes, with 0 resistance and no damage. The container lids were unsealed using cryo cutters, revealing what Traoré had long suspected. Sealed beneath hollow mineral bags were crystal slabs of synthetic amphetamines, high density, lab purified. The total weight was 10,000 ki. Packaging labels indicated a Luxembourg exporter known for operating as an agricultural aid broker, confirming the global reach of this criminal network. On the black markets of southern Europe, this haul was worth nearly $90 million, but then came the twist. 2 unregistered drones, sleek, Western-style reconnaissance models, were caught in a double orbit pattern over the area. Their altitude, heat dispersion, and signal bounce patterns were a near-perfect match for surveillance drones used in border security testing by European defense contractors. These weren't civilian toys. They were tracking movement and mapping routes. Who launched them? And why now? Were foreign eyes not just watching, but actively coordinating? While Burkina Faso's forensic division took over field samples, the Ghanaian tech unit unearthed something more chilling. They found shipping QR codes matching uninspected cargo that had entered through Lagos and Cotonou in 2023. The same names, the same destination. Research compounds in coastal Europe. One label read, Biogenic Export Parcel 22-6A, with vials marked for non-human testing and French regulatory barcodes. Nothing in the manifest mentioned amphetamine precursors. Traoré reviewed the chain of approvals. The documentation had been cleared under a diplomatic fast track, flagged as post-conflict agro-restoration. Yet, no ministry in the ECOWAS zone had issued an endorsement. The approval stamp traced back to a private audit firm in Antwerp, subcontracted through 3 shell logistics entities. It was all a sophisticated web of deception, hidden behind Sahelian dust and donor language camouflage. 48 hours after the bust, Interpol's West Africa Directorate issued its official release. It was hailed as a collaborative multinational success. One line, however, was not buried in translation. Interpol confirmed this was the largest seizure of synthetic drugs in West Africa since 2025. The forensic inventory listed one name repeatedly: Agri-Development West Africa. The name was everywhere, on packaging tape, embossed onto shipping seals, and featured prominently in the internal documentation from the intercepted cargo. Agri-Development West Africa. On the surface, it seemed legitimate, a European NGO focused on agricultural relief in post-conflict zones. But when Captain Traoré's cybersecurity unit accessed its registration, the coordinates led to an anonymous office suite in Luxembourg. The company had no published staff, no working phone number, and a website registered through a masking service. A deeper financial analysis uncovered funding flows from a conglomerate with holdings in pharmaceutical supply chains. The parent firm, registered in Basel, Switzerland, had a history of being investigated for violating export controls related to precursor chemicals used in stimulant production. One of its board members had even served on a policy task force under the European Medicines Agency. These connections were not circumstantial. They revealed a shadow structure operating beneath a facade of development. Among the seized files was a bilateral contract between Agri-Development West Africa and a semi-autonomous region in southern Libya. The clause that caught everyone's attention read, "Contents exempt from internal inspection to preserve temperature-sensitive bioexperimental materials." In effect, it authorized the cross-border movement of uninspected chemical cargo under the pretext of maintaining a scientific cold chain. Traoré raised the critical question: who enforces inspection when the law has been pre-written to allow for blind transit? The same contract bore stamps from a third-party verifier based in Malta, a firm previously implicated in falsifying agricultural certifications across North Africa. But even more disturbing was the language used in the accompanying shipment manifest. Terms like biosynthetic media, experimental stimulant substrate, and non-human field trial compound had all appeared before in DEA reports on diluted cocaine trafficking through Latin America during the late 2010s. Was West Africa now absorbing the very trafficking strategies once mapped through Colombia and Panama? The implications demanded more than a quiet investigation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré broke the story globally in a televised briefing, announcing that all supporting documents would be made public. He refused private negotiation and closed-door diplomacy. This was not a clerical error, he stated. It was systemic manipulation. Within hours of his announcement, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris contacted the Burkina Faso embassy requesting a confidential dialogue. A prominent EU policy consortium issued a public statement regretting the breach of procedural trust. But Traoré stood his ground. He distributed the evidence through open-source diplomatic channels. Independent fact-checking platforms in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa verified the document's authenticity. The West African Union for Security and Transparency issued a statement endorsing the disclosures. Soon after, the international media backlash began to fracture. What does it mean when an African leader refuses secrecy and still gets condemned? Shortly after the document release, a summit of ECOWAS interior ministers was convened in Accra. Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu reportedly expressed concern over multinational exploitation operating under goodwill mandates. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo called for a continental database on exempt cargoes. Algeria and Chad pledged legal teams to assist Burkina Faso in verifying historical entry points for suspected dual-use shipments. What emerged wasn't just one compromised organization. It was a complete legal ecosystem designed to make scrutiny optional. A leading French security analyst summarized it plainly in a broadcast on TV5 Monde. This isn't smuggling as we once knew it. This is policy-level trafficking, diplomatically protected, legally diluted, and systematically untraceable. Until now. The headlines came in like coordinated artillery fire. Burkina Faso detains EU relief shipment. Human rights violation, read Le Monde. Drug war or diplomatic disaster, questioned Deutsche Welle. NGO cargo seized in Ouagadougou standoff, ran the BBC World Ticker for nearly 18 hours. The framing was nearly identical. Western broadcasters and international policy journals pointed to the intercepted cargo as part of a misunderstood humanitarian effort. Terms like overreaction, unfounded suspicion, and diplomatic breach began surfacing in op-eds. None of the reports mentioned the amphetamine purity levels, the thermal signatures, or the drone surveillance patterns. Instead, they focused on confiscated medical-grade biological material, carefully avoiding the word drugs. A consortium of NGOs, including Médecins Sans Frontières and Health Horizons, issued a joint open letter demanding the immediate return of biomedical devices intended for experimental fertility programs in underserved regions. Their spokesperson, based in Brussels, alleged the seizure had jeopardized vital regional health partnerships. The letter was co-signed by a dozen European policy researchers and forwarded to the African Union Commission. The subtext was unmistakable. Burkina Faso had broken trust. Captain Ibrahim Traoré made no effort to soften his response. 48 hours later, at the Ouagadougou International Press Room, he walked onto the podium, faced over 100 journalists from 5 continents, and read just 3 lines. "This is not aid. This is murder with a logo, and I will not apologize for defending my soil." No additional remarks, no Q&A, just silence. But that silence detonated across social platforms. Hashtags like not aid, drug routes exposed, and yeah, African lives matter erupted. On TikTok and Instagram, young people across Lagos, Accra, Bamako, and Nairobi stitched Traoré's speech into montages with subtitles and protest banners. Within hours, a live stream panel from Ghana's University of Legon dissected the Interpol report, backing Burkina Faso's evidence chain. Then, political support began to crystallize. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana issued a televised statement affirming Burkina Faso's sovereign right to investigate cargoes crossing its borders. It was measured and legalistic, but unmistakably supportive. In Bamako, Mali's interim president went further, calling Traoré a necessary flame in a region long smothered by hypocrisy. These weren't fringe statements, these were heads of state drawing a line. Burkina Faso, long dismissed as a peripheral actor in West African geopolitics, now stood at the center of a moral collision. How is it that when an African nation enforces its laws, it is accused of aggression? But when those same laws are ignored by others, it's called partnership. Under pressure from African diaspora voters, European parliamentarians began demanding clarity. One Green Party MEP from Berlin asked the Commission to explain how Agri-Development West Africa obtained diplomatic exemptions without EU-wide vetting. In Paris, protesters gathered outside the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, holding placards that read, "Stop hiding the truth in aid." The optics shifted, the narrative bent, but Captain Traoré remained immovable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't finished. He called for an expanded inquiry, a joint regional task force and a public audit of all European-linked aid shipments entering the ECOWAS region since 2021. He made the documentation from the intercepted cargo open access. Investigative journalists in South Africa began tracing shipping routes, and Kenyan transparency watchdogs picked up the paper trail. Under intense pressure, the World Health Organization issued a lukewarm statement, citing the need for balanced transparency while maintaining humanitarian flows. But the tide had already turned. The story was no longer about aid. It was about sovereignty, exposure, and the audacity of a young captain refusing to blink. Behind the press and politics, one fact remained. No aid organization had offered to explain the presence of methylmorpholine sealed beneath their cargo, or why drone escorts were shadowing a relief convoy. And not a single Western broadcaster had retracted their initial framing. The morning after the press confrontation, before headlines could reshape public memory, the Provisional Government of Burkina Faso published a formal communiqué. Operation Sahara Sans Drogue was to begin immediately. It wasn't just a declaration, it was infrastructure. Maps were redrawn, and 11 key border points across the Sahelian belt were earmarked for permanent high-resolution scanning posts. These weren't symbolic checkpoints. They were designed as mobile, adaptive scanners capable of penetrating commercial freight, chemical tanks, and insulated NGO shipments. Traoré ordered that every piece of cargo crossing into the central Sahel, no matter the origin, no matter the logo, would be inspected. There would be no more free lanes for friendly donors. The political risk was enormous, but the momentum was undeniable. Watching the regional implications unfold, Interpol signed a 5-year data-sharing protocol. Their risk vector index, typically reserved for high-severity narcotics traffic in Latin America, would now include West African humanitarian routes. For the first time since 2008, a region previously flagged as logistically ambiguous entered Interpol's core surveillance focus. The agreement, sealed in The Hague, was set to extend until 2030, but international backing wasn't enough. Within days, Nigeria's Interior Ministry convened an emergency security caucus. By week's end, Chad and Algeria dispatched delegations to Ouagadougou. The joint proposal, A3ET Clean Transit, a continental initiative to synchronize African customs data, scan signatures, and GPS movement for all cross-border development cargo. In technical terms, it was a digital firewall. In political terms, it was an act of rebellion. For decades, African ports and corridors had been treated as logistical pipelines for the interests of others. Now, for the first time, Sahelian leaders were attempting to reverse that flow. What does sovereignty mean if a nation can't audit what enters its land? At the ECOWAS Extraordinary Budget Council, 11 member states voted unanimously to allocate supplemental security funding for buffer zone enforcement. This was no small gesture. ECOWAS had never previously adjusted its joint fiscal agenda for a single member state's domestic initiative. But Captain Traoré's investigation had unearthed a contagion far wider than Burkina Faso's borders. Mauritania pledged drone logistics. Benin volunteered airspace access. Niger offered satellite uplinks from its decommissioned French military towers. And then came a powerful statement from Nigeria's president. Africa cannot develop while its arteries are being poisoned by false partnership. Was this the beginning of a continental immune response? Inside Burkina Faso, the effects were already tangible. Customs officers, once resigned to routine, now received tactical training. Agricultural experts were embedded in cargo inspection teams to verify seed aid claims. Labs were established in Gorom and Diapaga to test unidentified compounds within 90 minutes of seizure. The results were shared in real time with partner nations. One intercepted convoy from Djibouti, flagged at the Tambao corridor, was found to contain synthetic methylamine with a purity level exceeding European industrial regulations. The cargo was labeled as anti-pest liquid for reforestation projects. How many times had similar substances moved unchecked before this? The question was never just about drugs. It was about how narcotics networks, cloaked in the language of development, had corroded sovereignty at its root. It was about how foreign contractors exploited gray zones in the law, and how donor mechanisms designed to help had become blindfolds for scrutiny. In a televised address, Captain Traoré summarized it in one sentence. "We don't just need freedom, we need a clean space for our children to breathe." His words weren't just a metaphor, they were administrative doctrine. In response, the African Union established a working group on sub-Saharan customs integrity. South Africa's Home Affairs Minister offered Nairobi its anti-smuggling AI for pilot testing in Mali. Senegal's Customs Commissioner began rewriting clearance codes for medical NGOs. Even Sierra Leone proposed an open ledger of aid transits to be reviewed quarterly by civil society panels. The news from Burkina Faso now traveled differently. No longer a footnote in security digests, it became a benchmark, a case study, a mirror. For generations, they told us Africa couldn't protect itself, that we were too divided, too under-resourced, too dependent. But on a crisp July morning, that story cracked. 10 tons of methamphetamine was stopped, not by American boots, not by European oversight, but by a young officer under the scorched flag of Burkina Faso. No borrowed uniforms, no foreign command, just one son of the soil standing in defiance. Ibrahim Traoré didn't drown his country in speeches. He moved with clarity, with nerve, with the quiet rage of a man who had had enough. "I don't care what they call me," he once said. "I care that our children live long enough to be called anything at all." This is not the end of the war, but something irreversible has shifted. For the first time in decades, Africa is not waiting to be rescued and not pretending to be asleep. This wasn't just a bust. It was a statement to every corridor of power still using this continent as a backdoor. Captain Traoré is no savior. He's not trying to be. He is simply a child of Africa who stood where many flinched. In a land they once called the blind spot of security, he lit a flare that can't be unseen. And now, Burkina Faso, once overlooked and underestimated, has become the center of the map. Ask yourself, what will this mean for a young person watching from your city? For a grandmother in Gao who buried her second grandson because the streets were no longer hers? The news from Burkina Faso isn't buried in the back pages anymore. It's being debated in parliaments, analyzed in embassies, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré's name is reaching ears that once refused to listen.